Hello, and welcome to another conversation from Net Zero Compare. Today, I am joined by Albert Slapp, president of RiskFootprint, a risk assessment technology company that helps property owners, investors, lenders, businesses, and governments understand exposure to flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, severe weather, and other natural hazards. Albert brings an unusual combination of legal, environmental, conservation, and technology experience. Before establishing RiskFootprint, he worked as an environmental attorney and served as director of the Colorado River Project at the Nature Conservancy. This is an increasingly important subject for businesses because physical climate risk is no longer only an environmental or sustainability concern. It can also affect property values, insurance availability, operating costs, business continuity, financing, capital planning, and investment decisions. In this conversation, we will look at how organizations can assess these risks at the individual property level, where current due diligence processes may fall short, and how companies should evaluate resilience investments, and also what decision makers should realistically be doing right now. Albert, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm really pleased to be here to speak with you and your viewers.
My pleasure. Albert, your background includes environmental litigation, conservation work with the Nature Conservancy, and now climate and natural hazard risk assessment. So to start, if you could tell us what experiences led you to establish RiskFootprint, and what gap did you believe existing property and environmental due diligence was failing to address?
Thanks, Carol. It's a bit of a long story, but mostly my career as an environmental attorney, and I also taught environmental law at law schools, was in the pollution area. So I really was not a CO2 or climate-oriented environmental lawyer. I was dealing with pollution. And the last case that I did, I'm retired from the practice of law, and at the ripe young age of 65, started this technology company, which we're going to be talking about. My last case, I represented the Waterkeeper down here in South Florida and Sierra Club in a case against Miami-Dade County's sewer department that was polluting the waterways. And we won that case to get them not only to stop the pollution of the waterways, but to upgrade the infrastructure, the water and sewer plants, because of sea level rise and climate change. And this was, to my understanding, Carol, the first case in the world where environmental groups sued the local government to get them to make their infrastructure climate ready and storm safe, and to raise them up because of sea level rise. Sea level rise was not part of the consideration before that case. And we were written up in the New York Times, and we were written up in Rolling Stone magazine. My kids thought that was great. They were very proud of me to be written up in Rolling Stone magazine. But the point is that got me thinking about the intersection of climate change and infrastructure and due diligence for property owners generally. And there were a lot of engineering firms, architecture and engineering firms, that were dealing with infrastructure. And as I thought with some scientists down here in South Florida about the due diligence issue and about how we could create a technology that would help property owners, we started with residential property owners and then included commercial, industrial, healthcare, and also local governments, but not so much from the infrastructure standpoint, but from the individual property standpoint. And what we saw was that there were ways in engineering and hydrology and what have you to look at individual properties and their risks, their hazards, but they weren't automated. So they were too expensive for most owners of property. And this was sort of at the beginning of the whole ESG movement, which really was started in Europe, and the disclosures and the regulatory requirements were of TCFD and ESG were really really began and took flight in Europe, particularly for disclosures for large passive investment funds. I did not want to be in that business. I wanted to be, as a lawyer, we, back in law school, right? In the first year of law school, everybody had to take property law. And one of the first things that we learned, and we learned a lot of Latin, I knew some Latin from, from high school, was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. And the concept of caveat emptor, and it's certainly in American law from British common law, was handled a lot by lawyers. But over the years, it has become very routine. It has lost a lot of its comprehensiveness and depth in the area of due diligence, and also in commercial lending. What we realize, Carol, to get down to answer your question, is that by now supercomputing and software code, cloud-based computing, and all the databases, we could automate that process of a hazard assessment, and then also include the climate data that is available from the IPCC and LOCA downscaling of a number of hazards. Not all the hazards are climate hazards, but we wanted a comprehensive due diligence caveat emptor report called the RiskFootprint, which is now 25 pages, that you could buy online. We sell these on our riskfootprint.com website. Anybody can go there in e-commerce, and you can get your report for a single family home in the United States or $100 million building in a matter of minutes. So that didn't exist. And now, when we started a decade ago doing this, there were not many competitors. Now there's a lot of competitors, and most of them are European. So you have Munich Re, you have Moody's, you have MSCI are the three big European companies that I can think of off the top of my head. But we had a little bit of a different twist to this. We wanted to not just what I call, sort of jokingly, the bad news bears. The bad news bears, whether it's climate or physical risk or a combination, they go, Mr. Client, here's your bad news. Have a nice life. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. That's not us. What we are trying to do with our workflow is to take the client, figure out what's going on at their property or properties, and then, like a Sherpa, like in the Himalayan mountains, where we guide them and help them carry the load to get to where. I call it sustainable resilience, and it includes net zero. I don't use the word sustainability or the word resilience. I like to merge them together in sustainable resilience, because that's our goal. Our goal is to have buildings more sustainable and resilient in the short term and the midterm. So in that transition zone of 2050, 2070, we don't have people leaving the cities because they're retreating, and there's not as much disruption of our societies, which is coming, which is here now. And yet, if we don't do that, if we just focus on reducing greenhouse gases, if we just focused on net zero without sustainer resilience, in my view, and I know there's quite a few people who might differ, we're not going to make it, because the reduction in greenhouse gases to make a difference may take us now with what the Trump administration has done to set us back. It may take us to the end of the century, and I'm not going to be around. And a lot of people are going to be greatly, and my grandchild, it will be greatly disrupted unless we can get the property owners that listen to you and hopefully are listening now to get on their radar and to get on their CapEx and OpEx the investments in existing buildings and new buildings that will be sustainer resilient. So they will reduce energy, they will reduce emissions, but they will also reduce floods. And I jokingly, I mentioned Mahesh Ramanujan, who was the CEO of the U.S. Green Building Council for many years, and he and I are friends, and we see each other at conferences. And I jokingly say to Mahesh, and he has a net zero group, the fastest way to get a building to net zero, my friend, is to fail to protect the lobby from the next storm. If you really want to stop emissions, all you have to do is not put any flood barriers or raise your mechanical switchgear equipment. And when it's knocked out in the next flood, because it's always a matter of when, not if, you'll have a net zero building. And we laugh and we joke about that. And it is a joke, but there's some seriousness to it. And the seriousness, Carol, is that we have to do both. It's all hands on deck. And I've had this discussion with Vice President Al Gore. I was a speaker at his climate reality in Miami years ago, and he introduced me to over 1,000 people sitting in the audience. And he said, some years ago, I wrote in a book that adaptation was laziness, that we really have to focus on CO2 mitigation. But he said, I don't believe that anymore. And I want to introduce you to my friend Albert Slapp, two Alberts, Albert Gore, Albert Slapp, who has a company that's trying to focus on adaptation and resilience of existing buildings. And we have to do both. And I think that's, what he now believes, and this is certainly what I now believe. And not everybody does. A lot of people don't really get that you have to do both things. And so 3 things, if we say all hands on deck, public infrastructure has to up its game. We have to reduce emissions, especially from large buildings, and we have to make those large buildings more sustainable and resilient. And if we don't do all 3 things at the same time, then we're going to have great disruption and retreat.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I would also note, and what I've observed, that probably that legal background gave you valuable perspective on how environmental risks move from scientific or legal concerns into real financial and operational consequences. So let us look more closely at the problem RiskFootprint is designed to solve. Because let's say when a company buys, finances, leases, insures, develops a property, we know that it usually carries out some form of due diligence. So what important risks can still be missed by standard property assessments, environmental reviews, what else? Flood zone checks or public hazard maps in your view?
That's a really great question. And it's one that's really on the front burner here in the U.S. And I'll explain to you why. There has been a kind of market basket in due diligence, whether it's the the owner borrower, say owner of a large building borrower, and then the banks, which are the lenders. So there's a market basket of due diligence. And in that basket is the building appraisal, the building title report, typically something called an environmental site assessment phase 1 that says environmental, but it's really just hazardous substances of petroleum products and underground tanks. And then possibly at a FEMA flood map, which is very limited, and possibly in certain areas like California, maybe an earthquake score. So that's it. Now with my offering, my assessment, which has 34 different hazards and others, which are come out in seconds and are very low cost and very good and very accurate, we've brought into, here's a basket and is kind of sitting at the top of the basket, and it's saying, "Let me in, let me in. Can I come in to the basket with all you other things?" And there's a lot of, "No, you can't come into the basket." Well, why can't I come into the basket? Because we've been doing this for 25 years one way, and you're bringing in a new way and 30 different hazards, and we don't know what to do with all that stuff that you're going to bring in. So you don't get in the basket with us. That's honestly, it sounds silly, and it's possibly a little bit of a dramatic example, but it's true that there is more current and future hazard data. So I mean current physical risks that are not climate risks like earthquakes and landslides and things like that. and also the future hazards, then the owners and the lenders know what to do with. They don't, they're very rules oriented, and also there's, for the owners, if I let this come into the basket, into my radar, what does it mean? What will I have to do? Will I have to improve my building? Will I have to make capital expenditures, operational expenditures? Will I have to put a flood barrier in my lobby? Will I have to raise my circuit breakers? Will I have to put a new roof on? What? And so what I have tried to do with my company is something a little different. And people say, "Well, Albert, what do you do?" And you say you have a report. It's called the risk footprint. So you're selling reports. And I go, that's just part of it. What my company does is we help to make decision making better and more accurate. And what that means is, and I don't know, Carol, if you're familiar with this organization, it's called ASTM International.
Actually, I also prepared one question regarding the organization, but we'll get to this later on in our conversation.
Okay. So they have this process that they just came out with called the Property Resilience Assessment process.
Exactly.
And also the U.S. Green Building Council has a climate resilience assessment process for the LEED certifications. And BREEAM has a similar process. And the American Institute of Architects has a process. So there's a number of processes, not just ASTM. And the process, the ASTM process, is one that we follow. There are 3 parts. One is, what's your building exposed to currently and in the future? So exposure. But exposure is just exposure. It doesn't mean that any harm is going to be done, because buildings are different. Some are older buildings that may be harmed. There are newer buildings that were built stronger to different building codes. So the second piece is vulnerability and the potential damage, loss, and downtime from exposures. And then the third part is, are there any feasible resilience measures and sustainability measures that could be implemented for this building or for a new building that would have a good return on investment. And even if they stop there, even if the owner of the building stops and doesn't implement anything, they've gotten to maybe the C-suite, the idea that there are some feasible, call them low-hanging fruit, things that can be done to his or her buildings that could have a good ROI. And guess what? It could make the building's market value hold up or even increase better than the competition. And LEED building, LEED platinum and gold and silver, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that has to do with energy efficiency and greenhouse gases and net zero. It doesn't have to do with resilience. But now if you were to merge those things together, sustain a resilience, if you merge those things together, then you really have something. You have a building that is not just green, but it's also hardened against what I call Mother Nature's butt kicking. Because you can't say that of a net zero LEED platinum building. You just can't say it. It's not meant to both reduce greenhouse gases and mitigate Mother Nature's butt kicking. They're two separate tracks, and they haven't been brought together yet. But when they are brought together conceptually, possibly regulatorily, and also economically, when they're brought together, we will be able to hold off the harms that are coming at us from climate change. But if they continue to be separate tracks, I doubt that we'll be able to do that.
As you were explaining, going back to my initial question, also I was wondering if there are any particular risks that companies frequently assume have been already evaluated when, let's say, in reality, they have not?
That's also a great question. So in the existing market basket is something called a FEMA flood zone, whether you're either in a 100-year flood zone or you're outside of it. And that has been part of the insurance world, mostly in the residential area in the United States, so that if you are buying a home and you are going to get a federally insured mortgage, which is most mortgages for residential, if you're in a FEMA 100-year zone, you must, by law, have flood insurance. And if you don't, you're not going to be able to get your loan. But the truth of the matter is that people assume that the flood zones and the flood map really represent the risk of flooding, and they don't. And they don't because they're out of date, and they don't because they never included heavy rainfall flooding. And I tell this story back in 2018 or 2017 with Hurricane Harvey in Houston, where 120,000 homeowners were flooded, and they were all outside of the FEMA flood zone, and hardly any of them had any flood insurance, and they were economically ruined because they thought, yay, for me, I'm outside the FEMA flood zone, I have no risk, and I don't have to have flood insurance. Whereas the truth of the matter is, and we use the Fathom Swiss Ray flood maps, which are really the gold standard for heavy rainfall flooding, riverine flooding, and coastal flooding. And RiskFootprint was the first company to integrate, first assessment company to integrate the Fathom Swiss Ray flood maps into our technology. So when someone gets a risk footprint report, Carol, they're getting not only FEMA, but they're getting the Fathom maps for 3 different types of flooding, and also the NOAA, which is a U.S. government agency, the NOAA storm surge maps. We also have the American Society of Civil Engineers tsunami maps for the United States, and we have NOAA and NASA king tide flooding maps, which are for areas of the tidal areas right near the coast of the United States. So we have the most number of flood maps and types of flooding of any of the vendors. Why? Because there's no one crystal ball. We have to show the owners and the lenders as much of the good stuff that we can get into our report so that they can make better decisions. It's not up to me to tell somebody what risk they can accept or they can't accept. And I have a kind of a funny story about that, which I may get to later.
Yeah, as I always say, we love examples and stories because they help to illustrate the problems in a very easy way. So if you have any examples or stories, feel free to always let us know. Also, thank you very much for those examples. Another thought that crossed my mind, that completing a standard due diligence process does not necessarily obviously mean that every material hazard has been properly understood. Once a company recognizes those limitations, I would say that the next question is what a more complete assessment should include. And RiskFootprint evaluates hazards at the individual property level. That's what I found in many resources online, rather than just relying only on regional or portfolio-wide averages. So could you explain how property-level risk assessment works in practice? What information is needed, let's say, to move from identifying that a hazard exists in an area to determining how vulnerable a specific building or site may actually be?
Right, great. Again, these are great questions.
Thank you.
So the risk footprint report was, and is supposed to be a initial, fast, accurate, and affordable. It's hundreds of dollars, even for a multi-million-dollar building, to point you in the right direction and to raise some red flags. So in the ASTM property resilience assessment, I talked about the 3 stages: hazard assessment, vulnerability and value at risk, and 3 is feasible resilience measures. My company works with other companies that are architecture and engineering and consultants that have hard hats and people who go with the work boots into the buildings and shine flashlights in the dark spaces. So when we do an initial run at, let's just say, vulnerability and the exposure, I mean, we know what the building is. We have some good information, but we don't have the full building plans yet. That's not part of the risk footprint. All we use is an address. But if the red flags show up in my report, then when you get to the stage 3, you'll look at, are there any protective mechanisms within the building already? And I'll give you one example, is that when a building was built, it was built to a certain building code. And a lot of times they all go back to the FEMA map and the FEMA base flood elevation for the 100-year flood. And the code may say you have to put your switchgear at or above the FEMA base flood elevation, which could be 8 feet or 6 feet or whatever it is above the ground. But it may be that the Fathom maps and the NOAA maps show that a flood could be much higher than the FEMA base flood elevation. And I know quite a few situations where the buildings lost their power because the flood went up above where the switchgear was and shorted all the electrical, the transformers and the switchgear out. And whatever pumps were there or what, the whole electrical system is shut down. So there's I don't need, they call it secondary modifiers, but basically what it is the reality of each building is different. Each building has different elevations, different construction type. The flooring may have a floating floor, may have a floor that has rebar into the walls. All of these things are different, and they present different risk levels to the building and to the structural integrity of the building. We did 9 large condos that in Pelican Bay, Florida, near Naples, Florida, that were very badly damaged by Hurricane Ian, and I'd say 8 of the buildings had floating floors, and I'll explain that, and breakaway walls in the garage areas. And one building was built a little bit before the other ones, and had the concrete floor of the parking garage with rebar into the walls and did not have breakaway walls. And when the floodwaters from Hurricane Ian came in 2021, I believe, the pressure lifted the floors because the water, it's like the ocean is coming around your building, and the groundwater is pushing up because the ocean is under the ground and above the ground. It's not just above the ground. People think, oh, there's a wave, it's above the ground. No, it's also in the ground and in the pore spaces of the sand and the soil. So as the water rises, the groundwater rises, and it's pushing up on the bottom of the building with incredible force. And in the buildings that had floating floors and breakaway walls in the garage area, it flooded. Cars were floating around, and no electricity, and the elevators were completely damaged. But the one building that did not have a breakaway floor, the floor was destroyed. And I walked around it. It was a very large building, a very large garage. You can imagine hundreds and hundreds of cars could be in there. And it was like popped, and the concrete floor was popped and disintegrated and cracked in most of the area of the garage because of the way it was built. And it was not engineered or designed to withstand these pressures of floods that people don't think about. You say, something's going to get wet. But it's also the structural engineering aspects of what it can do to your building. So to get back to your point is that, no, my report, it can't cover all those things, but it points the red flag because I'm showing the true height of the flooding in the models, not just one FEMA map that shows a 100-year storm when you're having a 500 or 1,000-year storm or a Cat 3 or a Cat 5 hurricane. So, you can't make good decisions with limited information from a FEMA flood map. That's not appropriate.
I have to admit that your answers and examples only reinforced my assumptions, because I imagined that knowing that the risk exists in one area is one thing, but understanding actually what it could mean for a specific property is much more useful for property owners and all actors in the market. Of course, that depends heavily on the quality of the data and the methods used, obviously. Climate and natural hazard assessments may combine government data sets, historical records, geospatial models, What else? I would also include projections, property characteristics, and probably engineering assumptions. If you could tell us, how should a business evaluate whether a risk assessment is reliable enough to support an investment, lending, insurance, or capital planning decisions? That would be great.
Well, I mean, the issue is really has to focus on whose ox is being gored, so to speak, because you're different. There's different levels of risk tolerance, but you sort of combine two issues that I talk about a lot. One is the quality of the data and what you should be able to trust and rely on, and the other is risk tolerance. So let me cover the first one, and then we'll go to risk tolerance, and I'll tell you a funny story. So, the break the data down into two parts: current risks based on historical models and future climate models. To break them down separately, the most reliable models are the models that are backward looking and are based on 100 years plus of historical data. Call them, flooding, earthquakes, wildfires, all sorts of different models. Wind, especially wind is another thing. And we know we can track tornadoes in the United States. We have data of the actual track of like every tornado that's occurred in, decades and decades and decades. So we know the path, we know the frequency, and these all been mapped by government agencies. And, some technology companies are like, don't listen to NOAA. Don't listen to the U.S. Forest Service. Don't listen to the U.S. Geological Service. We have the best damn data, historical data. We have the best damn data. We're the smartest guys on the block. Don't listen to them. They're just the government. But if you look at the delta, the difference between their models and the government models, there's very little difference. And any decision making that would be made by any of these users, whether they're owners or lenders or investors or what, would not be based on the delta between the government models that we use, which are open source and peer reviewed, and the smart guys who say, we have a black box, we have IP, we're not going to tell you how we did this, but we're so smart that you should just, fall off your chair and listen to us. But the truth of the matter is that the difference in the historical modeling is very small, and that's not how the decisions are being made. And the other thing is, before we jump to the climate modeling, which there are wide discrepancies in different people's models, is that the thing that your viewers should really understand is that deals don't get done on the basis of climate modeling. A building is bought or sold, and a loan is made or not made, and climate modeling does not enter into it almost at all, or very, very minimal. The purchase price, the tenants, the financing that's available, all of these things, that go into net operating income, and the debt service. If you said, in order to get a loan, you have to have a debt service ratio of I don't know, let's just say 1.25, which is the net operating income over the debt service. Does climate go into those calculations of these lenders, where they're lending 100 million, 50 million, whatever they're very little? And the hold time of most commercial buildings, some maybe hotels or whatever, could be 30 years, but most are 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And climate doesn't change that rapidly. So if you say, why would a climate change model impact a decision? You have to ask yourself, who's making that decision and for what purpose? I work at the deal level. That's what I'm here for, is to help on the deal level to have people make better decisions. And I have climate change models. I have the FEMA National Risk Index expected annual loss, the current historical expected annual loss, and also their future expected annual loss for 5 different climate hazards, in addition to the IPCC climate hazards. So I have 2 separate pages plus future sea level rise. So I'm not ignoring it. I'm putting it in there in case there's some user that does have a long hold time and really wants to explore what mid-century and late century might look like. But I realize that 80% of the risk footprint is current day hazards, or the Mother Nature butt kicking, and 20% is future. And I don't think the decisions that are made on deals are 80% current risk and 20% future. I would say it's 95% current risks and 5% future climate. Now, is that also true of European and multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar investment funds that want to tell people who give them their money as investors that they're green or that they have green funds? No. They want to show those investors that they know what they're doing in terms of having a green fund. But they also have other funds that aren't green, or they have a lot of different funds. So it's one type of fund that focuses on greenness. There's funds that focus on mining. There's funds that focus on oil and gas. There's funds that focus on artificial intelligence, whatever. So if you're focused on deals, your focus is a lot less on future climate change. That's my view anyway.
Got it. And what should decision makers ask to understand whether the data and models are reliable, valid, and detailed enough to make the decision they need to make? I was thinking about this question before our interview, and I was thinking at first about the risk score, but I wouldn't say it's a final answer, because companies still need to understand how it was created, what its limits are, and which decisions it can actually support, right?
Scores are terrible. We have scores, but it's a terrible way to make a decision on a building or an investment, because if you're wrapping 10 whatever different hazards into a score, right, into an aggregate score, and let's just say there's one high score, and that one high score is a hurricane storm surge, and you go, oh, this is a great investment. It scores a 1 out of 10, 10 being bad. And it only has one bad thing about it. And an investor might say, oh, it's only got one red score out of 10 or 15 or whatever it is. And then the next season, the lobby's wiped out by a storm surge. Then the investor says, but you guys told me it was a low scoring property. It was 1 out of 10. Well, that one thing, the storm surge, knocked you out, took out your investment. So bad on you. It's Scores, I honestly don't even know, that they're valuable at all. We have the Fathom Swiss Ray maps in the United States that are granular to 10 square meters and 30 square meters in the rest of the world. And, you know, we can see if the water's touching a building or it's not touching a building, or if it's close to touching a building. It's a map. How on earth could you make a decision on a score when we have maps that show if the water is going to intersect your building? It's not about a score. It's about the actual, and there's so much more to it. We have just we've been working with Microsoft Copilot AI, and we have developed, it's new, it's sort of in beta right now, but we're selling it. It's a companion to the risk footprint report. And what it does is three things. So the risk footprint report is 24 pages. It's very dense in science. And it has maps, and it has meters, and it has scores, and it has percentages, and expected annual loss, ratios, and all sorts of things. How do you put it all together in a decision making? Because I'm saying I'm selling better decision making, not just a report. So we worked with AI, and we, in particularly with Microsoft Copilot. And I got to say, I'm not a young man, but working with AI and training it felt like having a new puppy. And I've had a lot of dogs. I'm kind of a dog lover. And it's like you train your dog to be housebroken, and then every once in a while it pees by the front door and makes a mistake, and you go, oh, bad dog. But that's what AI is doing. Until you give it the skills, until you train it, it's like a puppy, and it can get very excited, and it can jump on people. Like that would be like a hallucination, like, no, you don't jump, puppy, you don't jump on people. But AI kind of in the hallucination. So I've been working with Copilot and getting it to do three things in this. I call it the executive summary companion. One, summarize for me, for the user, the 24-page risk footprint report and tell me what's important. I'm an executive, I'm a senior in the senior management. Number two, give me a 20-year hazard disaster history of the area, county, whatever, around the property, so I can put this in context. It's one thing for Fathom Swiss Ray to tell me that it could flood, but has it flooded there? How often in the last 20 years has it flooded there? What sort of disasters have been in the area? Could be wildfire, it could be, hurricane storms, it could be whatever, hailstorms. So AI does that. And then the third thing is that given 1 and 2, it provides a pathway. I talked about the Sherpa. A Sherpa has to follow a trail. They're not bushwhacking, they're following a trail. So it gives us a path to very high level resilience and adaptation ideas. Again, not architecture and engineering level, but ideas of where to go from here. What's next? And frankly, before AI, consultants did this and consultants could do this, but think about how much time it would take even a very smart architect, engineer, or consultant to do the three things that I just said based on a risk footprint report science. Number one, summarize all the science for executive level use. Number two, a 20-year hazard history of the area around the property. And three, what are your, some very high level recommendations? Could be 10 hours. I do it in 10 seconds.
Thank you very much for that answer. Now, I would like to talk about turning risk information into business decisions, because that's what actually counts for companies. A sustainability team, property manager, lender, insurer, other actors in that process, so procurement team and let's say chief financial officer, they may all interpret the same climate risk information very differently. So I was curious, how can companies translate technical hazard data into practical decisions involving asset valuation, insurance, let's say business continuity, maintenance, procurement, capital expenditure, and probably the list goes on and on?
Right. Well, the starting place is the ASTM property resilience assessment, which is the 3 stages. And that's the how up to a point. So it's the exposure, the vulnerability, the value at risk, and the feasibility. And what you can end up with there is some general return on investment or benefit costs of different options that you have, both CapEx options and OpEx options. But then you have to decide, am I going to pull the trigger on this? And am I going to go beyond the ASTM PRA into implementation? And what am I going to do it all at once? Am I going to do it in a staged approach? Uh, or am I just going to put it in the CapEx for future? But OpEx and annual testing of flood barriers and various pumps and other things, and also testing your emergency plans and procedures, um, tornado warning systems, safe rooms, all this thing that transcends both capital and operational activities. So um, you have to decide, am I going to go beyond the study and go deeper, let's just say down to an architecture and engineering level in the study, and then what am I going to do about it? And you mentioned insurance, and it's interesting because in my view, there's one insurance company, and that's FM, that has a publicly facing resilience credit program. So if you were to, at the end of this call, go to AI or go to Google and put in there, what insurance companies on their websites have a publicly facing resilience credit program, an actual, I'm going to give you money and discounts, whatever. If you do, because you're asking me, what happens if you do it? If you actually implement sustainer resilience, am I going to get some benefit other than reduce damage, loss, or downtime? Am I going to get a reduction in my insurance premiums? And what I like to say, Carol, about that is, number one, a lot of insurance companies talk a good game, but the only one that I know of that's definitely putting money that you can see is FM. I think others are, but it's more behind the scenes. They don't really want to tell people what they're doing because they might have expectations and they have a competition. They don't want the competition to know what they're doing. But certainly the owners of buildings are saying, Albert, I get what you're doing, but if I do it, will my insurance premiums come down? And the answer that I give them is sometimes yes, most of the time no. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the most reason is that the insurance companies kind of know what generally the reduction in losses will be for sustainer resilience. They do. And their models, they're called CAT models, do have inputs of what reduction in losses if I put a 3-foot barrier around my lobby for flooding, or I do something else. But they are not publicly providing those benefits to their insureds right now, as far as I can see. Is it coming? Yes. Is FM doing it? Yes. Have they put $1 billion behind that? Yes. Uh, do I think very highly of them? Yes. Do I have any stock? No. Do I get any monetary benefit from them? No. Uh, but that's not the point, is it really? What I'm just trying to say to your viewers is that that's a big issue. It's not the whole ROI pie. It's a piece of the pie, but it's a important signal, isn't it, for a decider in chief from an executive who says, if my insurance company is willing, if I do this, Albert, if I put in these new barriers, if I raise the switchgear, if I put a new, better roof on with higher wind uplift performance, if I do that, and the insurance company will reduce my premiums, it's a signal that all of your ROI calculations aren't a bunch of BS, that they're real. So we do ROI calculations based on changes to the building. Certainly for floods and wind and earthquake, we do that.
And
But
could you share an example where a risk assessment led the client to change their plans, priorities, or maybe investment decisions?
yeah, sure. So without naming names, we represented a large hotel REIT, a real estate investment trust in the United States, and they have 50 hotels, including a few in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, but mostly in the continental United States. And two of their hotels in Key West, South Florida, had been damaged very badly in Hurricane Ian and in other hurricanes as well. And Hurricane Ian, I think, shut one of the hotels down for a year. And they had decided that they were not using FM, but they decided that they wanted to go through the property resilience assessment process, and they wanted to go into the architecture and engineering piece of it to understand what they could do to make their hotels safer and more resilient over time. And we took them through that whole process. We did the exposure assessment. We did the vulnerability and value at risk before any changes. We brought in architects and engineers who guided them with a plan for external removable barriers, tiger dams, and doorway barriers, and getting rid of all the MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing in the basement, getting it out of the building and up on the roof and in the fire suppression pumps, pitless elevators, putting in pitless elevators, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they spent millions of dollars. And we also did both a before HAZAS, what we call HAZAS study for the damage loss, and an after the improvements, which brought the damage down tremendously. And then just in 2024, with back-to-back hurricanes Helene and Milton, they were down for, a couple of weeks. So their systems worked. And we were told, I don't have any proof of it myself, but we were told that they now have lower insurance premiums. Again, not from FM, but from other insurers and reinsurers through their brokers. But again, I don't have that much information on that. And I also have a client that had FM where they got our risk footprint report, which showed their property could flood. They did not do anything about it. Then in 2021, the remnants of Hurricane Ida in the Philadelphia area flooded the lobbies of two twin office buildings in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. And then afterwards, FM came in and rebated them significant money from their premium to put flood barriers in. And they've been fine ever since. Well, of course, there hasn't been that big a flood since the Hurricane Ida floods yet. That was 5 years ago. But so it's a coming thing, and of course the reinsurers, whether it's Swiss Re, Munich Re, Lloyd's, I mean, they're in Europe, they're, the big reinsurers. And so the question in my mind is, if not now, when? If has there not been enough proof that Mother Nature's butt kicking is increasing and it's just going to get worse? And isn't there Trump notwithstanding, that sea level rise and king tides are accelerating around the world? I mean, if not now, when? When are the insurance companies all going to get to where FM is and say, look, here's our public program. If you make your big buildings safer and more resilient and sustainable, we are going to reduce your premiums, and we'll have a program to monitor what you're doing and to certify what you're doing. You're not just going to give you a green light to go out and, put some plastic up and call it resilience. You're going to have to make your build. And that's what FM does with their own engineering department. Well, that's what we do. We're not FM Global, but we do the same thing. We're certifying, if the insurance companies are interested in it, we're certifying that the work was done and it was done properly. So when are the insurance companies going to step up to the plate with firm, disciplined systems, publicly facing systems that you can bank on when you do your NOI calculations?
Again, thank you very much for examples. You answered my question in detail. Now I would like to talk about prioritizing resilience investments, because I can imagine when an assessment identifies several risks, let's say across a building or a portfolio, companies rarely have the budget to address everything immediately. Let's assume that this is how it is and looks like in reality. In that case, how should decision makers prioritize resilience measures? And the second question would be, what factors should they consider when comparing, let's say, the cost of an intervention with possible property damage, operational downtime, maybe insurance consequences, tenant safety, and long-term asset value?
Right. So this is how I talk to my clients. We first take their portfolio of assets and we score them qualitatively using a green, yellow, red stoplight. And then we give it back to them. And let's just say there's 50 properties or 100 properties. And then they go over that list and circle core assets that are at high risk. So you don't necessarily have to take a deeper dive on every property. And because some properties you're getting ready to sell, some properties are small, or they're not core in terms of revenue producing. So circle the core assets that are at high risk in our scored Excel spreadsheet portfolio. Then we do the risk footprint report, which is the deeper dive, 24 pages, for the core properties, that core assets that are at high risk. Then we have another conversation. And of those core assets that are at high risk, have any of them already been damaged by Mother Nature or had a close call. So now you have, we're trying to triage this, right? We're putting it through like a funnel. So you start with putting all the properties in the top of the funnel. Then you filter out for core assets, high risk. Then you have a filter of which ones have, really experienced either some damage or a close call. And then you take a look at those and you say, do I really want to go through the PRA, the ASTM PRA process? And by the way, the ASTM PRA process is not a US process. It's ASTM International. It applies anywhere in the world. It's just a discipline, smart way of thinking about how I make better decisions. That's basically it. So now you know that you don't want to spend money and you don't have money to spend on every property or properties that you're not really care about that much. But now at what's coming out of the bottom of the funnel in the little spout is 10%, 5% of your portfolio that you want to really look at. And you're going to probably have to spend some money, architecture, engineering consultants to come on the property, which gets more expensive. And then you're building up this information and modeling and looking at it economically, financially, and then you'll come up with a decision. Is it going to happen now, this year, in this fiscal year, or next year is going to be in the CapEx? And what about the OpEx issues that we talked about? So that's that image, if you will, of the funnel and how we work with clients to get it down to a manageable number a year. And you can keep putting it in the funnel year after year and see which are the ones that come out that would have a higher priority for CapEx and OpEx improvements.
I can imagine that kind of prioritization is important, especially for companies that have limited budgets and cannot address all of the risks at once, as I mentioned at the beginning. But also it raises one more difficult question, which is how can they actually measure the financial value of resilience investments? Because as I can also imagine, unlike an investment that directly increases revenue, the value of resilience may come from losses, disruption, or repair costs that never occur. So the question would be, how can a company build a credible financial case for resilience spending, right? And to what extent can it estimate avoided damage, reduced restoration time, lower business interruption, or protection of an asset's value?
Well, I think we've talked about some of the ways that it can be done through the hazards, damage, loss modeling, the before and after, and then put that into your ROI, return on investment, or benefit cost analysis. And then the time will tell. And as use cases are built up, the benefits, and you're talking also about some financial and also some non-financial, like reputational improvements or reputational damage. If your building goes south and tenants have to leave and maybe their employer doesn't open up again in their city, and that hurts a lot of people. I mean, most of my clients are multi-billion dollar companies with lots of properties. And I care about them. I care about the executives that I'm working with and their jobs and making them look good. But I also have in the back of my mind that the improvements that we're making go to the tenants, the workers that are in these buildings, the restaurants, the shops that are in these buildings, the workers there, that if after an event, they're able to come back to work pretty quickly, right? Because the building did some sustainer resilience work. Um, I feel good about that because those are average people who benefit. And I'm not sure there's exactly a way show show the economic benefit, but it's certainly a good reputational benefit. And you see nowadays, I mean, large buildings and their owners are marketing the wellness of buildings, the air quality of buildings, the microbial quality of buildings, the zen and feng shui of buildings, or whatever you want to call it. But darn it, the the lobby doors open to the sidewalk. The lobby's less than a foot above the ground level. And they're going like, well, whatever city I'm in, certainly their stormwater system and their sewers can handle. No, 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 no. No, they can't handle it. They're built on 10-year rainstorms or 5-year rainstorms. And Mother Nature is handing us 500 and 1,000-year rainstorms. And you're betting, you're making decisions about your $50-100 million building that Mayor so-and-so's got the stormwater under control? I don't think so. That's just a bad bet. You should treat your building like it needs to be fortified. It probably needs to be fortified in some area, and I can help you find the area it needs to be fortified.
And where should companies be cautious about promising a precise return on investment? Would it be this fortification you are talking about? The risk of environmental potential risks?
I think I understand your question. I mean, in terms of guaranteeing, nobody I'm not in, I don't suggest a particular product. I have no product involvement. I don't sell insurance. I don't sell products. I'm not a general contractor, an architect, or an engineer. We're sort of science nerds who help you with decision making. But I think to answer your question is that, and this kind of goes back to something of the tolerance for risk, is that let's say you're in Miami or Naples, Florida, and you know that there could be a big storm with 10 feet of storm surge coming at your building, which would destroy the lobby. And, so you ask some people, well, what would it really take to protect my lobby from 10 feet of storm surge? And they go, well, that would, take $20 million if you really wanted to do that. And they go, well, I can't. So what about 3 feet? And, which would be a category 1 storm instead of a category 3 storm. So we're always talking about risk tolerance. We're never talking about a bubble. It's like, Mars base station where there's a bubble over where, Elon Musk and his buddies are going. No, we're talking about trade-offs between getting some risk protection, which we know is going to work. If you put a 3-foot barrier and the water stops on the outside of the building at 2.5 feet, you've reduced your damage to zero because you've blocked the water from coming into your building. If it comes over, then it's coming over. But then you have insurance, and maybe you have pumps on the other side, or whatever you're trying to work out. So there's always there's always that trade-off between what is feasible and what is cost effective. And I did want to tell sort of a funny story. So if anybody wants to Google Miami billionaires bunker, just Miami billionaires bunker. It's always going to come up. Indian Creek Island in the Intercoastal Waterway, just north of the city of Miami. And it's an island with the whole center of the island is a golf course, and there's 41 homes, and every home belongs to a billionaire. Jeff Bezos is there. Mark Zuckerberg is there. It's unbelievable. And not only they're buying lots, for 150 million, or there's a home there, they knock it down, they put a palace up there. And the whole island, it has one bridge on and off it, and it's maybe 3.5, 4 feet above sea level. It's probably one of the most risky pieces of property in the world, really.
It's such a high price.
In terms of its risk for flooding, storm surge, sea level rise, king tide flooding, winds, hurricane winds to 170 plus miles an hour. And you ask yourself, would Jeff Bezos ever cite an Amazon warehouse on such a risky piece of property? No. Would Mark Zuckerberg ever cite a data center on such a risky piece of property? And the answer is no. So you ask yourself, well, why would they spend 150 million, 300 million, whatever, on pieces of property in the Miami billionaires bunker island? And the answer is their risk tolerance is different than yours and mine. Because if they lost that home, palace, whatever it is, completely in the next hurricane, it would not make any difference financially to them whatsoever. It's a small, if you are worth 50 or $100 billion, $150 million is a very small amount of money, right? So that what I use that story a bit jokingly. I have nothing against them. It's America. You can do whatever you want. But I use a story to get to your point, Carol, that it's never about completely zeroing out risk. It's about trying to figure out for you and your company and your building or your home, what is that fair balance between what the risks are, what you're willing to do about the risks, and what you're willing to accept of the risks that you can't adapt to or to harden to.
Got it. And now I would like to look at the problem from a little different angle. I would like to touch on insurance availability and the protection gap. Because nowadays, many property owners are experiencing higher premiums, larger deductibles, reduced coverage, or difficulty securing insurance in areas exposed to flooding, wildfire, hurricanes, or other hazards, which you've already mentioned a few times today. So in your view, how is the insurance market changing?
Well, I really think that that's just the other side of the same issue, which is insurance rates are going up, both for residential and for commercial. And they're thinking about it. The insurance companies are thinking about it, that Mother Nature's butt kicking is becoming more and more severe. And we don't like losses because we have to pay out money. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to raise our rates, and we're not going to insure in certain areas of the country. And that will force homeowners like myself just recently and out in California to go to state systems. Here, it's in Florida. It's called Citizens, which is the state homeowners insurance program. If you can't get insurance, and in California, they have a state program for wildfire insurance. I think they also have one for for earthquakes. So I again, we're here telling stories, but I live uh, in Boca Raton, Florida, and actually live closer to the Everglades on the west side than I do to the ocean. But I do live in a hurricane zone and a hurricane wind zone. So I currently, this may be interesting to your viewers, I currently pay about $6,000 a year for my homeowner's insurance. But they break it down, when they send your bill. $1,000 annually is for every risk except hurricane winds, and $5,000 is for hurricane winds. So when you think about it, the insurance company saying, well, his house could burn to the ground, or, you know, thieves could come in and, steal everything, or whatever it is. And we would make money if it wasn't in a wind zone. We could only charge them $1,000 a year and we'd still make money, because those things are very rare and it's probably not going to happen. But 5,000 of it is for the hurricane wind. Now, a lot of the insurance companies and the brokers say to people like myself, get a new roof. And we have the Spanish tile roofs in my neighborhood, and so a lot of the elderly people listen, we're not going to insure you unless you get a new roof. Uh, and so they have a roofing company come in, they take the old tiles off, and they put a new membrane, like a plastic membrane, over the roof, the wood roof, and then they put new Spanish tiles back on the roof. Looks very nice. But they don't go in the attic. They don't improve the tie down of the roof to the walls. So they're going like, I got a new roof and I have a new membrane, but the small leaks in an old membrane, or whatever it was, tar or whatever they put in when they first put the roof in, is not where the big damage is. Where the big damage is that the roof comes flying off because it's not tied down to the walls properly. What I did to my home is that the insurance agent said, get a new roof. Your insurance, if you want to control your insurance costs, get a new roof. And I said, it's $30,000 or $40,000 to get a new roof. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So for $5,000, I got a crew in there who went into the attic. They put straps, they put clips to the boards, to the, they put bracing in, bigger nails. And this has been something that I'm able to at least talk to the insurance companies about, that I have taken additional steps. Now, can I prove that this is keeping, I got out of Citizens. I was with Citizens, which was a state. I'm now with another company. But the point that I'm trying to make is that my example on a single family home is the same, conceptually, the same example if you had a $50 million office building. It's the same thing, which is you have to be smart about what you spend your money on to get the most bang for the buck, and insurance premiums are part of it. And, you said, well, how are the insurance companies looking at it? And I think I said that in the beginning, that they haven't really stepped up to the plate.
If I understood correctly, I would say that suggests that companies may need to move from simply declaring that the building is resilient to documenting exactly what has been assessed, implemented, and verified. And probably a more standardized assessment process could help provide that evidence. And if you remember at the very beginning of our conversation, you already mentioned the ASTM. ASTM, that stands for American Society for Testing and Materials. And you've been closely involved with the ASTM Property Resilience Assessment standard. So if you could briefly tell us, what does the standard add to the commercial real estate due diligence process, and how does it differ from simply purchasing a climate risk report or, let's say, reviewing a hazard map?
Right. So the ASTM Property Resilience Assessment Standard, which is a little over a year old, has three parts to it. One is what you were just referring to as a standard property hazard assessment, like the risk footprint report. The second is looking more closely at the building's vulnerability to those hazards and how that could cause damage, loss, and downtime for the building. And then the third part is, are there feasible, maybe low-hanging fruit methods to make the building more resilient, and what would their costs be? So it's very simple. That's the PRA process. But as I said, it doesn't get you to the finish line. It only gets you to a point where you can decide that you want to approach the finish line a little closer.
And who should currently be considering a formal property resilience assessment? All companies, all buildings that are in the risk zone?
Um, that's a really good question as well. There's a lot of different use cases for the PRA, and let me go through them. We talked about portfolio. We talked about the funnel. So the funnel is, I have a big portfolio of properties, and some of them are getting their butts kicked by Mother Nature. I want to put it through this funnel process. And that's the beginning. The funnel process is also uses the PRA concept: hazard assessment, vulnerability, damage, loss, and what's feasible. So that can be your funnel. Now, from a lender's point of view, we talked about the market basket of the due diligence. So whenever there is a commercial loan or a residential loan, the lender is looking at some risks to see whether it's a credit-worthy loan and to see whether it is too risky for the bank. And now they were happy with the 4 or 5 things that were in the market basket, but now I sort of gave the analogy that all of these assessments like ours are creeping and want to get into the market basket. So part of the market, part of what's creeping in is definitely stage 1, which is the hazard assessment, sometimes the stage 2, very rarely the stage 3 as a lender. We did have a situation, actually 2 situations, where 2 different developers, one developing a hotel resort and the other affordable housing, high-rise apartment building, had gotten construction loans, and they they went to the different banks. They went to the banks to get a permanent financing for their properties. And in both cases, the bank, in order to give them the permanent loan, because they were in risky areas, wanted to get our risk footprint report and the damage loss estimates, including the as-built aspects. So it's the damage loss as represented by a brand new hotel resort and a brand new apartment building. And in both cases, we showed that the standards that they had constructed to were quite good and that the potential damage loss was small, and they got their loans, and apparently they got favorable insurance premiums to go along with that. So now I've described the portfolio use and the lender use. I could go on and on like that. There's, again, it's the the ASEAN PRA is for commercial only, not for residential. And it can be used in certainly the portfolios. It can be used in lending. It can be used when in just normal retrofit. And here's an interesting factoid for your listeners. In the United States, in commercial real estate, so think about United States, big area, commercial buildings, lots of buildings, trillions of dollars of buildings. Every year, all those buildings have some improvements to them, whether it's a boiler that needs to be replaced or the roof needs to be updated, whatever it is. It's just normal wear and tear retrofit. That market is a $60 billion a year market for normal retrofit of commercial buildings in the United States. What I say, Carol, is that every dollar of the retrofit of commercial buildings, every dollar is a decision point. And that decision is, am I going to invest $1.30 because I'm going to make it sustain and resilient, or am I going to just spend $1 for like-kind improvement? So, for example, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I can put under the code, because my building was built in 2010, I can put on a 90-mile-an-hour roof, but I need a 150-mile-an-hour roof because I'm in a hurricane zone. Now I can spend $1, $100, whatever it is, for a 90-mile-an-hour roof to replace it in like kind, or I can spend $130 to put a better performing roof. What should I do? What should I do?
You should follow the local regulations.
Well, it's not a regulation. The regulation says you're grandfathered. In the United States, that's what I was trying to say to you. In the regulations, an existing building, when it makes improvements, unless it's like torn down and a brand new building is put in there, or it's been very, very damaged and it's more than 51% of a replacement, a normal retrofit only has to meet the standard that it was originally built to. So whatever the standard was 20 years ago, that's all a retrofit has to meet. So when I say $100 versus $130 for a better roof, that's the decision, everyday decision that the property resilience assessment can help them with. So you said, well, what are some types of use cases where the PRA can help? And the portfolio, the lending, and the normal retrofit to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to step up to the plate and make my building better? Or am I going to just keep it at what it was back in 2010?
Exactly. And as you said, it's a huge market. And lastly, on the same point, when actually should this assessment take place? I noted down 3 potential and possible points on the timeline. During an acquisition, before financing or insurance is arranged, or as a part of ongoing portfolio management, or maybe it depends on the case.
I'd say it depends. It depends on the case because, acquisition, definitely on a regular basis, could be every 3 years, 5 years, to go over your portfolio, depending on how often it changes. If you're refinancing, that's another time to use this. If you're refinancing, to determine whether you can get better terms and conditions from the bank, if you can show them that your risk is less.
Okay, as simple as that. Perfect. And for our final question, for our final main question, I would like to make this practical for companies that may be at an earlier stage. So let's assume a company with a portfolio of properties, suppliers, operational sites, and other physical assets. Where should it begin actually? If you could tell us, where would a sensible first-year approach look like for identifying high-risk locations, investigating the most material exposures, assigning responsibility internally, and also, let's say, incorporating the findings into investment, procurement, insurance, sustainability, and business continuity decisions? I know it's a lot, but yeah, the businesses have to take all the different factors into account.
Well, I think, Carol, that uh, for different businesses, it's going to come up at different times, under different circumstances. I would just say that, um, it's when we're talking about the mind, we're talking about decisions. Decisions are not out there somewhere; they're in people's minds, and we're about, as I said, helping people with the decision-making process, but that means helping them think through what is the best thing for them and their company under the circumstances for the here and now. So when in their minds and the minds of their colleagues is are these issues coming up? And again, we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about acquisitions, we've talked about portfolio management, we've talked about normal day-to-day asset management and retrofit. We've talked about, like I said, refinancing and things within the whole financial system. And if you were just in the banking world, uh, thinking about what's happening with climate change and that it's time really to work on credit decisions and underwriting decisions that use parts of the ASTM PRA that will help the banks make better loans. So there's a lot of different decision points, but we're talking about, you can't get to net zero, we can't get to sustainable resilience without the mind deciding that we got to do something. So we're talking about something that does not exist in the real world. It exists in our consciousness. I don't want to get too philosophical here, but we are dealing with changing people's minds to change their behaviors, to bring that in touch with the changing climate.
Okay, I can see how that gives companies a much more practical place to start, because they may not be able to address every risk right away, as we already talked for our today's conversation many times. But at least they can identify the main priorities, and they should try to identify those main priorities and then decide what to do next. Before we close, I would like to give you some room to raise anything we may not have covered. So is there anything important that we have not touched on that you believe property owners, let's say investors, lenders, insurance, sustainability teams, or other business decision makers should understand about physical climate risk and property resilience?
Hmm. I would just say that, for my friends and colleagues that uh, are in the ESG and net zero area, is that, I told the story about Vice President Al Gore introducing me and saying that he had changed his mind, that adaptation was laziness. And I think that that world of ESG and net zero is changing. I think that, and it's also, as I said, all hands on deck. So we need everybody working on all these issues. But there are still people out there who think that this is all about regulatory reporting. And they are focused on the intricacies of the regulatory reporting to open their minds to the fact that these are real buildings with real people who are not billionaires, who work in these buildings and then go home to their families and have jobs, and that they're at stake too. That it's not just about the, call it greenwashing or whatever you want to call it, or getting these companies to appear to large investors as these caring companies that are trying to do something, when in fact the proof of the pudding, as they say, is at the asset level. Either the assets are safe now or they're not safe now. And what they will be in 2050, or certainly 2070 or beyond, is anyone's guess. And that we can't, without knowing also what Mayor so-and-so is doing about seawalls and doing about stormwater systems and pumps, and what the communities are doing about overgrowth of brush in wildfire areas, and what's going to happen in Los Angeles when all the growth grows back, and who's responsible for cutting it back. I mean, seriously, how can you say how important the regulatory reporting is when what's happening on the ground is ignored, and we don't have good solutions for making homes and buildings and infrastructure better? And we don't know in 2050 which communities will fail and which communities will be able to step up to the plate. Miami Beach is different than Hallandale Beach and this beach and that beach, because they have billions and billions of dollars of tax revenues that they can throw at problems. But smaller communities don't have the money and aren't going to be able to do it. So just giving somebody a score, well, your building is in such and such an area and it has a score of 3, it probably doesn't include sea level rise. Your score doesn't include sea level rise and tide flooding, number one. But number two, you don't know what the community resilience is. So all of these numbers, and you talked about, well, there's such a wide disparity of future climate modeling between this company, X company, and Y company, and Z company. Which one do you believe? Which one don't you believe? But the point is that they're not able to take into consideration in these models, really, what the communities are doing or not doing, what the commercial buildings are doing or not doing, because there's no model for that. There's no database that's telling people around the world what's happening in Mumbai and what's happening in Paris and Minneapolis, or what. They just don't know that. So the future modeling is not really that pertinent for deals that get done now, and deals that get done now need to factor in sustainer resilience to buy us time as a world to reduce to net zero. But if you don't help the buildings and the people now, by the time we get to net zero, it could be chaos anyway, because we didn't do the work in the here and now. And that's been my soapbox. I understand I've said it kind of a number of times over the last.
Some things need to be repeated multiple of times.
I really appreciate you had great questions, Carol. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast, and I hope you'll get some questions and you feel free to forward them to me. I'll be happy to answer any questions or any, feedback would be great.
100%. Albert, thank you for joining me today and for helping us examine how climate and natural hazard risks can be translated into practical property, financial, insurance, and resilience decisions.
Thank you, Carol.
My pleasure. And for the Net Zero Compare audience, this discussion is a useful reminder that physical climate risk is not limited to sustainability reporting. It can directly affect assets values, capital expenditure, insurance, financing, and long-term business planning. Listeners and readers can learn more about Albert's work and RiskFootprint through the company's website. You can also subscribe to the Net Zero Compare newsletter for more practical conversations, articles, and updates covering climate, sustainability, ESG, and the transition to a lower carbon economy. Thank you.